And this was also excerpt 2 from the reading from Arian, PS 17, right? Where Alexander is now unifying mankind by bringing together Greeks and Easterners, making them one. That there is now one people, again, according to Alexander, right? Which involves lots of marriages and his new kind of successor troops, right? Persian or Asian troops who have been armored and trained in the Macedonian fashion, right? But again, all this seems to do is anger a bunch of his soldiers, and the army mutinies once again. All right, so Alexander keeps moving westwards until eventually he's going to die the next year at the city of Babylon, right? He dies of illness, which seems to have been heavily exacerbated by both stress and alcohol. So then this leads to the question of succession. Who is going to inherit this giant new empire that Alexander has created for himself? So there are 1.5 options, I guess, at the moment. He has a half-brother, right? So another child of Philip II from a different mother. The half-brother has some sort of, it appears to be rather serious mental disability. We don't really know much about it in detail, right? And his first wife, who was the Bactrian princess, right? Bactria is modern Afghanistan. So she is pregnant at the time when he dies. So the Alexander's generals basically agree that, okay, the half-brother is the heir, and if the Bactrian wife gives birth to a son, then they will be joint kings together. Who smells recipe for disaster here? Recipe for disaster happening, right? So one of Alexander's leading generals at the time, a guy by the name of Perdiccas, is then appointed regent, right, for the one, possibly two kings, that he will rule until one or both of them is able. Okay? Now, a lot of the other generals aren't really happy about this, right? Because, well, the half-brother's probably not going to be accepted as king ruling in his own right. Don't even know if the Bactrian wife is having a son. Who's ending up with most of the power? The regent, Perdiccas, right? So a bunch of other generals, right? They're like, I'm not really happy about this. You know, he's getting all the power. They reach a compromise where they're going to be appointed as satraps, as governors for key regions of the empire. Now, as soon as news of Alexander's death reaches Greece proper, there's going to be revolts, right? Various Greek city-states are going to, again, escape from Macedonian rule, including Athens. Again, it's not going to go well. They're all going to be crushed. This is, I think, important for our purposes, right? Because not only is Athens defeated and brought under Macedonian control, but the democracy is going to be dissolved, so that Athens is going to be run by a new, more oligarchic governor or government under Macedonian authority. Questions here? All right. So, immediately everyone sees the writing on the wall, right? So these satraps, right, these newly appointed governors, various other ambitious leaders who, you know, are trying to kind of gain power for themselves, they like immediately start trying to build up their own power bases and their own force. Like they know where this is going, right? That this is not going to end peacefully with a king ruling over them. So 2 years later, one of these satraps, right, remember, kind of ex-powerful Macedonian general, a guy by the name of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's kind of right-hand men. He was appointed satrap of Egypt, right, a very wealthy, very, in its own right, kind of powerful territory that he is going to govern. So they are shipping Alexander's body back from Babylon, where he died, to be buried in his family tombs in Macedonia. Ptolemy, however, has the funeral procession intercepted and has Alexander's body brought to Egypt, where he is going to be buried in Egypt. Okay? Why does Ptolemy do this, do you think? What's the goal? What's the goal, Anthony?
Show like he's the next king.
Right. By kind of linking himself to Alexander, having Alexander's body at his capital, right? Again, a way of trying to kind of increase his own prestige or legitimacy. Perdiccas, the regent, isn't happy about this. He immediately invades Egypt, then loses to Ptolemy and his forces, and then Perdiccas will be assassinated by his own troops. Does not end well. So what this then leads to for the next few decades, for maybe the next 20 years or so, is an extended period of conflict. And this is both kind of hot conflict, where people are actually fighting with one another, like hot war, and also kind of Cold War type conflict, right, where they're kind of working against each other behind the scenes, even if they're not actively fighting, right? Between, again, rival satraps, leaders, anyone else who wants to get a foot in the door. 317, Alexander's half-brother, again, one of the joint kings, will be assassinated. A few years later, Alexander's son, right, from the Bactrian princess, will die, right? We don't really know why. Lots of people at the time suspect that he was poisoned. Out of the way, right? At this point, no kings. The individual satraps and leaders start declaring themselves kings, right? So they start declaring themselves kings of their particular region, possibly with an eye, at least at first, of claiming Alexander's title / Persian title, King of Kings. But no one's quite strong enough to do it at this point. So, by the time the dust settles, 281, everyone pretty much realizes they're at a stalemate. That no one is going to be strong enough to kind of hold on, to take control of Alexander's empire all by himself, right? So Alexander's, kind of territory has kind of fragmented into 3 big states or kingdoms and a couple of smaller places, right? The 3 big ones are the Ptolemaic kingdom, right? Which is the kingdom that is ruled by, at first, Ptolemy and his descendants, which you can see is centered on Egypt, pushing into Libya, part of the Levant, right? The Seleucid kingdom, ruled by another general by the name of Seleucus, which is going to control Asia Minor, Syria, big chunk of Asia, although they're not going to hold on to that for very long. And the family of Antigonus, right? Another important Macedonian, who's going to control Macedonia and parts of Greece. But then we'll start quickly losing parts of Greece that we'll talk about in a second. Okay. So, historians, modern historians, usually refer to the use the death of Alexander to mark the end of the classical era of Greek history. So again, this is a bit of a kind of subjective, artificial ending point, right? But historians like it because really what's going to happen over the next few hundred years is that we're going to see some significant changes to the Greek world, to the Mediterranean world, right? Something that's really going to set it apart from what came earlier. So kind of makes sense. We talk about this new era, 323 to 31, as the Hellenistic era of Greece, right? Where does it get its name? Because it's the spread, or it's kind of it's exemplified by the spread of Greek language and culture, right? Now again, this is not simply a one-way transmission, right? In many ways, there's kind of a cultural blending going on with underneath kind of a Greek surface, right? An important element also that's happening is that it begins to facilitate a global conversation, that disparate peoples from different parts of Asia and Europe, through the Greek language and kind of a common culture, are going to become increased communication with one another, which is going to lead to, again, an unrivaled level of information exchange. So new ideas, new understanding of the world, all of this is going to be happening in the Hellenistic era. We'll show you some examples in a second. Okay, questions here? Questions? No? Okay. All right. So, Hellenistic era, right? What defines it? what we're going to see over this approximately 300-year period, again, is an unparalleled, at least up until this point in history, movement to people's ideas and goods across the Afro-Eurasian world. Right? It will transform the world. Alexander, okay, he does some impressive things as a general, granted, right? But his kingdom basically barely outlasts him. He's not super important because of the kingdom or the empire that he builds, right? Historically speaking, really what makes Alexander the Great so important as a historical figure, right, is that he is going to kind of kick off this cultural connection. That through his military efforts, again, he is going to bring different peoples into closer contact with one another than ever before. They're going to be aware of peoples that they had never been aware of before, right? And again, this isn't happening out of nowhere, right? He's building on, say, what the Persian Empire did, right? But again, he takes it to another level. And that is going to lead to what's happening on the top, right? That's what leads to almost kind of a changing of the world. So, some things that kind of typify a Hellenistic era, right? Growth in every way imaginable. There's going to be a massive economic boom all throughout Afro-Eurasia, right? Increase in trade, spread of Greek-style coinage to different areas of the world, right? Makes trade easier, more money. Huge kind of new developments in culture and art, science, medicine, philosophy, right? Immigration to new areas, settlement, population growth. So all of these things are happening during the Hellenistic era, right? The Hellenistic world is growing in every respect. And again, when we talk about the Hellenistic world, right? So here's Afro-Eurasia in 250, right? Kind of the Hellenistic world is going to spread all along the Mediterranean, right? So kind of all the Mediterranean here, throughout the Middle East, even, kind of to the coast of South Asia, up modern Afghanistan, even kind of pushing into Central Asia. That you're going to find elements or remnants of people who spoke Greek, who used Greek coins, who consumed Greek literature, right, and so on, right? So the Hellenistic world is big. So when we say Hellenistic Greece, we're not just talking about Greece. In many ways, we're talking about that. All right, that was the end of that. All right. So, let's look at some evidence here. Again, Hellenistic art up here, right? So new styles of art, right? In this case, right, we're seeing an evolution of kind of how bodies are represented in sculptures, right? We went from like very stiff statues, kind of some movement. Now we've got kind of all different types of kind of body parts twisting and, kind of definition of, kind of muscles and bodies and all this stuff, right? So again, these are like new artistic techniques that are coming out of the Hellenistic era. We did that one, we did that one. All right, so Hellenistic politics, right? Big shift. During the classical era, the primary kind of Greek political unit, the city-state. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, so on. That was the default. When people thought of Greek politics, they thought of city-states and city-state politics, right? Hellenistic era, this is going to shift. The kingdom is going to become kind of the default or the norm, right? That when people think of Greek politics, they're going to think of kingdoms, right? So again, these kingdoms are going to be run in the style or kind of in the tradition of Alexander, right? That he sets up with an absolute ruler, right? So a king who holds all the power, right? And a king whose power stems from their association with the divinity. Okay? So remember, this is the thing that gets Alexander into a lot of trouble with the Macedonians, because Greeks didn't do this. Who did this?
Right.
Persians, Asians, Egyptians, right? Non-Greeks, right? But now it's going to become for these Hellenistic kings, right? Many of whom are descended from these Macedonian generals, it's going to become the default, right? They're also going to kind of merge together kind of the Macedonian/Persian style of monarchy with local traditions, right? So the Ptolemies, right, for example, are not just Macedonian kings, they're not just Persian kings, they're also Egyptian pharaohs as well too, right? So again, a way of establishing legitimacy over their new kingdoms. They kind of adopt established customs. When you get kingdoms, right, ruled by dynasties, this actually opens up more kind of opportunities for women to kind of serve as political leaders, right? So either kind of informal political leaders, such as Olympias, who was the mother of Alexander, one of the wives of Philip II, who wielded a great deal of informal power herself, right? So she was one of the most powerful figures in the world based on what she could make happen. Or even kind of formal defined power, such as the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, right? Kind of the famous Cleopatra, who is ruling Egypt as a monarch, right? So because of this dynastic inheritance that monarchies are built on, this opens the door for more women to have a political role. Not a lot, right? Because there's not that many royal families, but perhaps more than before. Okay, questions here? Okay. All right, the Hellenistic kingdoms. Rosetta Stone, just for example. Everyone's heard of the Rosetta Stone, right? Okay. So why is the Rosetta Stone famous? Anyone know why it's famous? Briar?
It had compared text, which gave linguists the ability to decode what hieroglyphics actually meant.
Exactly, right? So Egyptian hieroglyphs, which are at the very top, right? We were having a really, really hard time figuring out what they meant, right? Here we have the same text inscribed in 2 different languages, 3 different writing systems. We've got Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top. We've got the kind of Egyptian cursive or Demotic script, so same language but just different notation. And then down here we've got Greek, right? And so, you know, people at the time, historians at the time when this got discovered in the 19th century, right? They could read Greek. They knew what this said. And so now you know what the text says. You can use that to translate the hieroglyphs, right? So this was the key to kind of unlocking our understanding of the ancient Egyptian language. But very few people know what the Rosetta Stone, what the text on it actually is, right? And so the text itself is actually, it's technically a law, but it's kind of instructions issued in the name of King Ptolemy V of Egypt about how the royal cult was supposed to work. In otherwise, how Ptolemy V was supposed to be kind of honored as a divine adjacent figure. Not quite divine himself yet, right? But as a kind of divine adjacent king, how he was going to be worshipped, what this is going to look like, right? Well, there's going to be statues set up here, and the statues are going to look like this, and then 3 times a day people are going to do that, yada, 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 right? So again, the text itself is, how is this new king, this kind of, you know, young teen, right? How is he going to be honored, you know, celebrated as a king in this religious way, right? Gets printed up, 3 different writing scripts, right? Why is it written in different languages?
Because everything is like multicultural.
Right, yeah, right? So Egypt, there's going to be people that read and speak Greek. There's some that's going to be, you know, still only read and speak Egyptian, although it's going to become more and more common that Greek is going to become kind of a primary language. The hieroglyphs, really less for reading and more for kind of ceremonial purposes, right? But again, that's the idea, is that it is speaking to a multicultural audience. Right.
The Middle Egyptian, is that the same as like Coptic?
It's going to be the antecedent of Coptic. So Coptic is going to come from it. So not exactly the same, but moving in that direction. Okay, other questions? Okay, all right, anyway. Hellenistic cities, right? So again, growth. Old cities are going to grow bigger than ever before. New cities are going to be built at a record rate, right? And these cities are going to be kind of the hearts of the Hellenistic world, right? They offer new opportunities, economic opportunities, intellectual opportunities, political opportunities, right? They're encouraging immigration, especially in new cities, right? You need people to live in it. So you're gonna get urban centers, again, that got diversity of peoples. You know, in Egypt, you're going to have people not just from Egypt, not just from Greece, but also from all over Southwest Asia, right, originally. So very, very cosmopolitan centers. So one of the key examples, Alexandria in Egypt. So a new city, a new port city that was allegedly planned, or at least ordered to be planned, by Alexander himself. So when Alexander visits Egypt, he says, we're going to build a new city here, right? Maybe he actually planned it himself, right? Now, how do we know Alexandria was a planned city? Well, apart from the fact that they tell us Alexander planned it. But if you were looking here at a site map of the uncovered ruins of Alexandria, right? So this is what ancient Alexandria looked like. How do you know it was a planned city? It's on a grid shape, right? That cities don't grow organically this way, right? Organic cities grow like, if you've been down to like Lower Manhattan or like the Wall Street area, that's how cities grow organically, right? We've got all kind of windy streets, things kind of get a little bit bigger, but nothing quite lines up, right? Because they're built in stages. If you're gonna build something like a grid system, that's planning it from the very beginning, right? And again, very planned. So you've got housing, all sorts of stuff back here. You've got central areas. Here's the gymnasium, here's the marketplace, you've got the famous Library of Alexandria, you've got the Museum of Alexandria here, right? You've got the port up there, right? So again, built from the ground up to be an important city, right? And it will come to be that this will be a political and economic center, not just of Egypt, but really of the entire world, okay? Again, they have an open immigration policy. Anyone can pretty much come and be a citizen of Alexandria. It means it's going to be a very diverse population, even by Hellenistic standards. Commercial port. So if you've heard of one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria, right? That's going to be built at this time. Massive lighthouse that's built that in theory is going to be shining, you know, all the time, especially at night, because ships are coming into the harbor 24/7. The shipping in Alexandria never stops because, again, it's just so big and there's so many goods coming in there, right? Also, the Great Library, right, which supposedly held the greatest or the biggest collection of ancient Greek and I guess other ancient texts, right? But also a major center for learning, right? So scholars of the world are going to meet at Alexandria at the library, right? As they work on new things, right? So again, it's going to be like a kind of meeting spot, so to speak.
Do they copy like these books and texts, and do they transport it to other parts of the world?
Yes.
So when that fire, I think it was a fire that actually destroyed it. Was all the material like lost?
As
Like
far as
most-
we know, yeah. So we don't know exactly. I mean, we don't know exactly what's lost, but I mean, clearly there's things that don't survive. Now, there was lots of stuff there where it probably wasn't the only copy of it, right? So it's not like, well, the library burned down and there was one copy of something. I mean, maybe that was the case, but most stuff there would have been multiple copies other places, but that, for whatever reason, didn't survive either. All right, anyway, Alexandria. Good, right? Okay, big city. Again, here are just some artistic recreations, right? So based on kind of literary descriptions of what the White House may have looked like, right? So again, this big, massive structure with a big light peak in the top. Here would be kind of the main kind of I guess, street for Alexandria, leading down the side to the port, right? So again, massive big city. Okay, 3 main kingdoms. We talked about that. Context of last class. Kingdoms are fighting for power. Johan.
The lighthouse.
Yeah.
Did we find like ruins for it, or like do we know that it actually existed?
I mean, I don't know what. So we have ruins. So there's currently a city, like the city of Alexandria is still there, or at least the modern city is kind of built on top of it. I know that we found some kind of ancient ruins I don't know off the top of my head if we found anything that we can definitively say was the lighthouse. Part of the reason is because the coastline has changed. But I think everyone feels pretty confident that it was there because it's mentioned in multiple sources. So there's multiple authors, contemporary authors, that talk about this big lighthouse being there and describe it. So because of that, like, it's certainly something that was like technologically possible. So it wasn't something like, oh my God, this would have been impossible to build. So given that it was feasible and that so many people talk about it, we assume that it was there. We might have discovered some pieces that we could say that's lighthouse, but I don't know. Actually, break from that. That reminded me of something else I meant to say. Questions from last time. So sorry for this brief segue. Moses with horns. So yes, there is a tradition of representing Moses with horns in the Middle Ages. Like Moses, the Jewish prophet and leader with horns coming out of his head. Does not seem to have anything to do with Zeus Amun. It comes from a translation. It comes from the translation of the Jewish scriptures into Latin. So the word used, or the word in Greek was shining. The word in Latin, when the text gets translated into Latin in the 4th century, the word in Latin means both shining and horned. So same word means both, right? Now the big question that people don't really know is that why then did they represent Moses with horns? Because all the people who did this, like the artists, they know that the word could mean both, right? So it wasn't like, oh, I didn't know it also meant shining, right? So for some reason there's a tradition of doing this. People can't decide if it's a good thing or bad thing.
Thank you.
Long story short, silver mines at Lorient continued to be used, right? Don't know how productive they were. I think that was that you, right? Yeah, were they still using them? So right, so the big silver mines where the Athenians got the money to build their fleet, right? There's still reports that they're active, but they don't seem to be all that impressive because no one really talks about them. Jeremy.
Was there like a historian that determined what the 7 wonders of the world were, or was it just like who was that?
Yes, so there was, so that's the thing, is that we talk about there being 7. In fact, there's a lot of ancient writers that talk about wonders of the world and talk about different things and don't. There's one author, I want to say it was Apollonius, I don't remember. It was actually someone who was a librarian at the Great Library. But he came up with a list of 7, and then his list kind of becomes, after the fact, kind of the default. So yes, there is someone, I think it's Apollonius, but I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to check that. But his list of 7 becomes like the most popular list.
I guess, is there a significance to like the 7, like it being 7?
They like the number 7?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, 7 is a popular number for a lot of reasons in a lot of cultures. I don't have another good answer for that. Brian?
And the 7 wonders, were they all simultaneously existing at the time that Apollonius wrote it down? Because I'm pretty sure like the Hanging Gardens.
No, yeah, the Hanging Gardens were supposedly destroyed.
That's what I was saying, like the
Yeah.
Hanging Gardens were like.
Pyramids were
gone.
there. I think Colossus. That was going to be destroyed by an earthquake. I don't remember. To be honest. So I'll see if I can look. All right. Yeah. So it's one of these things that we've made it in kind of this big, really interesting thing. Ooh, 7 wonders and stuff. Like they liked wonders, but it wasn't anything kind of like strictly defined back in antiquity. They're like, oh, hey, there's a bunch of cool stuff. Let me talk about it. But they weren't necessarily special in the way that we might make them out to be special today, right? The special set of 7. All right. Anyway, but I will see if I can find out more. Back to Hellenistic era. All right. Kingdoms, right? The default kind of form of politics. But the other big thing, right, is that we get the rise of leagues, right? So leagues, again, a translation of a Greek word, we've seen it before, right? We've seen Delian League, we've seen Hellenic League, we've seen Peloponnesian League, right? Which is used to describe kind of these alliances or alliances, right? Where really it's not a group of equals. So these leagues, they use the same word, but it's actually something a little bit different, right? So again, as we mentioned, Greek city-states are trying to regain their independence, right? The first attempts right after the death of Alexander, completely unsuccessful, right? They rise up, just get squashed. And so what this really reinforces is like, look, the Macedonians and these successor kingdoms are too strong. One city can't stand up to them, even if it's Sparta, right? What we need to do is work together in a more formalized way. So not just alliances, but we need to have kind of more structure. So what these leagues are essentially federal states, right? So an early example of a federal state. So the city-states themselves are still independent, right? But they each send a representative, right? And each of these representatives will elect for a 1 or 2 year term a general, a governing council, and even an assembly. And that the League Assembly will be responsible for essentially foreign policy business. So kind of internally, city-states are kind of doing more or less their own thing, but they agree, right, that this League government, right, kind of head of the military, governing council, assembly of voters made up of representatives, they're going to decide kind of what our foreign policy is. And this is going to be really successful.
So it's like the UN.
Yes, but the foreign policy is, I would say, a little bit more binding, or at least they treat it as a little bit more binding, right? So we don't know all the details, but it seems to be, because sometimes you get like kind of disputes in the UN, like the UN might vote to do something and someone's like, no, right? I'm going out on a limb here. It seems maybe be less of that, right? That somehow the states themselves are more committed to this being a formal decision that they're going to go along with. But that's probably a good comparison. Okay, the two biggest and most powerful of these leagues are going to be the Achaean League, which is going to be formed by cities here, primarily in the Peloponnesus, right? They're going to band together, minus Sparta, right? Sparta doesn't play well with others, but pretty much everyone else. And then the Aetolian League up here, and then down there in red. So these two leagues are going to give the Hellenistic kingdoms, especially the nearby kingdom of Macedonia, excuse me, a run for their money. Excuse me. So let's look at 18, paragraph 237. Try not to hiccup. Unsuccessfully. Pages 6 and 7.
Through 7?
Yeah, 6 and 7. Pages 6 and 7. Okay, has everyone had a chance to review paragraph 37? Yeah? Okay, so what does this tell us about leagues? What do we learn, Anthony?
Weren't they in conflict with one another?
Okay, where do you see leagues in conflict with one another?
I think it's at the start, at the same period, the King League and King Philip with their allies were entering upon a war with the Aetolian League, which is called the Social War.
So they weren't always in conflict with one another, right? But the leagues are operating as states, right? And that they aren't necessarily allies. At this point, this is the beginning of Polybius' history, 220, right? That there's a war going on between the Achaean League and its ally, the king of Macedonia, Philip. This is different Philip than Alexander's father, right? Against the other big league, the Aetolian League. Right? And alliances are going to shift and change all throughout history, right? So again, they're states. They're not necessarily opposed to kingdoms. They're not necessarily friends with other leagues. They're working in their own self-interest. All right, what else do we learn about leagues? Briar.
They tried to organize a proper Peloponnesian League again, but everyone was just out for their own interests.
Sort of. Do you think that Polybius would argue that there ever was a proper Peloponnesian League? There had been a Peloponnesian League. But do you think he would have called it a proper Peloponnesian League?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. Probably not. I would agree, right? Why? To you or to anyone? So there had been an older Peloponnesian League. Why would he, and he doesn't actually mention it in this paragraph per se, right? But based on what he wrote in the paragraph and what you know about the Peloponnesian League, why do you think he would not have viewed it as a proper league? Who's that? Brian.
Because as previously mentioned, and everyone in the league was out to secure their own power.
How does that reflect the earlier Peloponnesian League? Right.
They were united for a common purpose to defend themselves,
Yeah.
kind of like out of desperation rather than let's all electively work together to make everyone's lives better.
Even still, kind of What was the earlier Peloponnesian League?
The Spartans were kind of imposing themselves onto the other people like really forcefully instead of it being like a collaborative.
Right. So it was billed as a self-defense league, true, and it did work in self-defense, but it was pretty much like Sparta and friends, right? And who was in charge of the Peloponnesian League? Sparta, right? Did you have a choice to be part of the Peloponnesian League? Not really, right? You had to do what Sparta said. Go on.
I think you're trying to get at that they're like proto-empires, like they're more like empires than
Which is, what's the there you're talking about?
the
I think you're right, but you said they're like proto-empires. You're talking about
the like in Greece, because
right?
the leagues that are like fighting there, the Aetolian and the
Right, the Achaean leagues. Are they proto-empires?
I think so, yeah. If I'm reading this correctly.
Okay, so why do you think they're proto-empires?
Because they're all out for themselves, right? They're it's like you said that they have that one that one power that's ahead of everyone else.
There's an issue here, though. That's not the league that he's talking about here, though, right? That's the older ones in the past that would have fallen into that model, like the Peloponnesian League or the Delian League, right? Where there's, in many ways, an empire, right? We even call the Delian League the Athenian Empire, right? Here is something different. What does the league look like? Well, he's talking about two periods. He's talking about what the league looks like at the beginning of his history in 220, and then what the league looks like in his own day, which is, going to be about 40 some years later. Jeremy, what do you have?
Bottom 7, he's like,
all states have the same magistrates, senates, and judges, nor is there any difference between the entire Peloponnese and the city. I'm guessing Greece, it's against Sparta. Except in the fact that its inhabitants are not included within the same law. In other respects, both as a whole and in their individual cities, there's a nearly absolute assimilation of institutions.
Okay, so that's related. What does that mean?
He's basically saying like this is different from the past where like there was a difference between the entire league and like the main city that was really in charge of everything. Like this time, they're all united, they're all together.
A good thought, but he's all right. So maybe let me help break this apart, right? So he doesn't mention the older leagues at all here, the older ones from like the Peloponnesian War. He's talking about leagues at 2 points in history. So one, his history starts about 220. And so he's talking about what do leagues, what did they look like then? Kind of these earlier leagues. And then what do they look like by his own day, which are a few decades later. Okay? So he says, but in regard to the Achaean League, this is in the second paragraph, right? Like 2 sentences down, I think. And the royal family of Macedonia, it will be in harmony with my design to go somewhat farther back. For the latter, right, has become entirely extinct, the royal family of Macedonia. Because, well, Romans. More on that later. Okay? While the Achaean League, as I have stated before, have in our time, meaning his time when he's writing, made extraordinary progress in material prosperity and internal unity. So what do the leagues eventually achieve? According to this sentence here.
Unity.
What does that mean?
They all share the same. They all share the. Well, he's saying that they share the same institutions.
Right.
So everything's the same no matter what.
Why is that important, do you think? You're right, you're 100% right. Let's go on. For though many statesmen had tried in past times to induce the Peloponnesians to join in a league for the common interests of all, and it always failed, because everyone was working to secure his own power rather than the freedom of the whole. Right? So couldn't quite make a real league happen because everyone's focused on themselves, right? But now, in our day, this policy has made such progress. Things have gotten better. Material prosperity, unity, right? This has led to, right, a common interest. That they're working together for the league, not for their own city interest, right? And as evidence of this, right, is that there's not a difference between the cities anymore. It's almost like they're all parts of one city, so to speak. They've got the same magistrates, they've got the same structures. So it shows that they're kind of in sync with one another. That they're not trying to one-up each other, they're not trying to control one another, like has happened in the past, right? But they're all working together for their common interest. And that kind of unified social structures is evidence of that, right? They're all doing the same thing, right? That means they're all going to end up in the same place. No one's going to be more powerful than the other, but the league as a whole is going to be stronger. And that's what he's saying. That's where we end up, and that's the good thing. Kind of make sense? Right? So again, it's this idea of a league as a federal state, that it's not simply an alliance of cities, right? Where one city might be trying to one-up the other, even going back to the older example, right? But they've learned to come together over time to essentially function as a single entity. And since they can function as a single entity, it's brought prosperity, they've been able to compete with the kingdoms. Brian?
Oh, no, I was just stretching.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, we're at 5:30. Okay. And again, what does it look like? He talks about identity of laws. Everyone in each of the cities, which if you remember, kind of domestically are still technically independent, but are following the same laws. They have the same magistrates, the same senate or kind of council, the same judges, right? So again, speaking to the idea that they are united in form because they are united in a common purpose, is the idea here, right? So again, federal state competing with the kingdoms. All right, so on that note, then who is Polybius? And who was his father, more importantly? If you look at the introduction to this, page 1.
Actually, Lee was one of the 1,000 Carthaginians that were sent into Rome as Rome conquered the Greeks in 168 BCE.
So who was Polybius then?
He was a Roman historian that wrote about the rise of Rome, and it's
Not Romans, well, not quite Roman. Not quite Roman. Who's Polybius? We'll come back to you because you're right there. But who is he?
wasn't he Greek?
He's Greek. He's a member of, at least originally, sort of.
He was the son of an influential member of the Achaean League.
So he's part of the Achaean League, right? This big, remember we were just talking about? The Achaean League has become this big, powerful federal state, right? That can go toe-to-toe with kingdoms. This is his league, right? This is where he is born. Who's his dad? Just generally speaking.
Influential member of the
King, right? So yeah, so he's like one of the important kind of politicians, leaders of the Achaean League. That's his dad, right? So his dad is like one of the leading figures here. He's a young man, right? What happens in 168? The Achaean League gets smashed by Rome.
He was taken hostage.
He was taking hostage, right, to Rome. Where this is where kind of Anthony's kind of right. Roman historian, not quite, right? He still sees himself as Greek and Achaean, but he's now kind of part of the Roman world. And he basically becomes part of, or becomes at least attached to, a group of really influential Romans.
Did he also compare and contrast the phalanx and
He did,
legions?
yes, which we will talk about that a little bit too. Now, why is he writing his history? Anthony was exactly right? So, paragraph 1 of book 1, on pages 1 and 2, the very introduction to his history. All right. First, he talks about why history is important in general. Then, moving on, the second half of the paragraph, he says, least of all myself, for the surprising nature of events which I have undertaken to relate is in itself sufficient to challenge and stimulate the attention of everyone, old or young, to the study of my work. So he's like, I've undertaken this task, everyone's going to be interested. Can anyone be so indifferent or idle as to not to care to know what it means, right? So he's like, my work is important. No one is going to not care about this question which I am addressing, right? To not care or to know by what means and under what kind of polity almost the whole inhabited world was conquered and brought under the dominion of a single city of Rome. And that too within a period of not quite 53 years. So what is motivating him to write this history? What question is he answering for his audience? Anthony, now say it.
About the rise and the rise of Rome and its dominion.
What has Rome just done? It has just basically conquered a good chunk of the known world. Polybius is like, a lot of people have no idea how this happened. We'll talk more about that later. He says, my work is going to show you how that was possible. So that's what's driving his history. As part of this, right, he's got to talk about the Achaean League, right, which is going to get caught up in this Roman rise to power. All right, so speaking of that, who was Aratus of Sicyon then? Who's Aratus of Sicyon?
He was a Greek statesman.
Right?
He helped unite Greek cities into the Achaean
Achaean League, right? So he was one of the most influential members of the Achaean League, leaders of the Achaean League. He was a general for many, many years, right? And he was kind of responsible for making the Achaean League as big and as powerful as it was. It was also important for another reason. And remember the other reason why he's important?
Didn't he also invite Antigonus?
In what way?
I think he gave him like a fort or like I think it was a citadel.
Yeah, I
based
mean,
on the reading.
Part of the foreign policy, yeah. He was also a historian. That he wrote his own history. And Polybius decides to begin his own account where Aratus of Sicyon left off. He ended in 220, so that's where I'm going to start mine. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time. Phylarchus. So page 26, 256. This is super important, especially for one of the prompts on Essay 2. For the history of the same period with which we are now engaged, there are two authorities, right? Where is Polybius getting his information from? Because again, he's talking about things that have happened decades before he was alive. He says, well, there are two authorities, two previous writers who are considered experts. Aratus, who's Aratus? The guy we just talked about, right? Who was the leader but also wrote his account. And Phylarchus, this other guy, whose opinions are opposed in many points, and their statements are contradictory. So what problem does Polybius the historian run into in this first sentence?
The fact that like both Aratus and Philip, how do you say it?
Phylarchus.
Phylarchus,
Yeah.
like their opinions are like contradict each other, so it's
Right.
hard to get like an objective view of the situation.
There you go. Well, not just objective. If you are using them as sources, right? These are your sources for writing your history. What's the problem? In some places, they contradict each other. So how do you know if you're the historian, Polybius, what happened? He's got to evaluate it. He's got to decide which one he believes. So he goes on, right? I think, therefore, it will be advantageous, or rather necessary, since I follow Aratus in my account of the Cleomenic War, right? So who does he follow as kind of being more accurate? Aratus, right? To go into the question, to explain kind of, basically his reasoning here. And not by any neglect on my part to suffer misstatements in historical writings, to enjoy an authority equal to that of truth. The fact is that the latter of these two writers, right, Phylarchus, has, throughout the whole of his history, made statements at random and without discrimination. What does he think of Phylarchus? Or what does he accuse him of? He has made statements at random and without discrimination. What is he saying about Phylarchus the historian?
He's challenging his authority.
How so? Yes, how so?
He's just talking with nothing to back.
There you go. He is basically talking without anything to back it up. He is, kind of making stuff up, right? Or just accepting things without questioning it at all, right? So he's like, this guy's worthless, sort of. It is not, however, necessary for me to criticize him on other points on the present occasion, or to call him to strict account concerning them, right? So he's made this stuff up. I don't need to talk about his other faults. But such of his statements as relate to the period which I now have in hand, that is the Cleomenic War, these I must thoroughly sift. They will be quite sufficient to enable us to form a judgment on the general spirit and ability with which he approaches historical writing. So he's like, I'm not going to evaluate all this stuff, but I'm going to show you some specific stuff here that just shows you how bad he is. It was his object to bring into prominence the cruelty of Antigonus and the Macedonians, as well as that of Aratus and the Achaeans. And he accordingly asserts that when Manatea fell into their hands, it was cruelly treated, and that the most ancient and important of all the Arcadian towns was involved in calamities so terrible as to move all of Greece to horror and tears. And being eager to stir the hearts of his readers to pity and to enlist their sympathies by his story, he talks of women embracing, tearing their hair, and exposing their breasts. This is a sign of sadness. And again, of the tears and the lamentations of men and women led off into captivity, along with their children and aged parents. And this he does again and again throughout his whole history, by way of bringing the terrible scene vividly before his readers. I say nothing of the unworthiness and unmanliness of the course he has adopted. Well, except I say this: let us only inquire what is essential to the purpose in history. Surely a historian's object should not be to amaze his readers by a series of thrilling anecdotes, nor should he aim at producing speeches which might have been delivered, nor study dramatic propriety in details like a writer of tragedy. But his function is above all to record with fidelity what was actually said or done, however commonplace it may be. Okay, so what is he accusing Phylarchus of? Well, already earlier he said, well, he was saying things at random without discrimination.
Embellishing and dramatizing situations,
Okay, why is he doing this?
make it more, whatever, interesting or appealing
To
to his audience.
Right, to his audience, to his readers, right? He's going to write up these big dramatic scenes with all this horrible stuff happening, and his readers are going to eat it up, right? But what's he not doing, right? That again, he's not, he says, the historian's function, this is what Phylarchus is not doing, but what he should be doing, is to above all record with fidelity, with accuracy, what was actually said or done, however commonplace it might be. You tell the truth, even if it's boring. Okay? All right, so this is, again, insight into Polybius' view of what a historian should do and what his goal is with this account. All right, last thoughts? No. Okay, so everyone have a great rest of the day.